So I finally saw Supergirl tonight. As for my usual seizure warning, there weren't really any sequences in this film that gave me concern. No major sequences with flashing lights or anything that gave me concern that could trigger a seizure. Again, disclaimer, not a doctor, not an expert, just a rando trying to look out for others. So those of you who live with photosensitive epilepsy, trust your best judgment, but this film should be considered relatively safe. That's most I can say. I'm not an expert, and as I've learned more about photosensitive epilepsy, I've learned more and more that going to a movie theater is a crapshoot no matter what, but that's at least the warning I can give just as a guy trying to look out for others. Now, I know I'm pretty late to watching this movie. Life's been a bit crazy because I've been trying to survive at work, trying to navigate various other things, as well as getting ready for a tournament, and now currently waiting for signs that my ankle will be healed up before said tournament. And so here I am at the theater on a Sunday night, and fortunately, I had enough rewards points through this local chain Megaplex to be able to see this movie for free, so I only ended up paying for concessions. Now, I'll admit, I tried my best to avoid reviews as much as possible before going into this film, but I couldn't avoid some of the hyperbolic YouTube thumbnails, some of the hyperbolic YouTube titles, and that naturally colored my expectations going into this film, since a lot of people were saying the film was either bad, or that it was mid, or that it was a nothing movie. And so I acknowledge that may have tempered my expectations going in. But going out of it, I enjoyed the film. I'm going to start with what I specifically liked first. When it comes to Supergirl as a movie, you have to kind of look at it in the context of what came before, Superman. And I feel this film is a good thematic complement to the previous film. The reason I say that is because one of the biggest themes that the film really goes out of its way to establish is how different Kara is from Clark. This isn't just Superman with boobs. This is very much a character, her own unique character, who is more in touch with Kryptonian culture compared to Clark, who grew up on Earth. And the film does a really good job of both establishing and exploring that contrast, and even giving us some very, very interesting thematic and narrative parallels between the two characters. I wish I could go into more detail, but it would technically go into spoilers. But let's just say they've really presented Kara as pretty much an opposite to Clark, someone who very easily could have become, well, a villain, a dark reflection of Clark, but through happenstance and through the right kind of influence, still ends up being the kind of hero that she's supposed to be. Again, she's not going to act exactly like Superman, nor should she be expected to. She is a completely different character with a completely different background, and the film goes out of its way to establish that, yeah, she is different from Clark and has a lot of really good, really valid, really well-developed reasons to be different. And her kind of coming into her own as a hero in her own right is very much the core part of the story here. And so that was something I really liked. I liked how they explored that contrast, how they explored how different her experience is trying to acclimate to Earth and trying to basically find her place in this wider universe as a Kryptonian, as one of the last of the Kryptonians, compared to Clark, who basically is thriving. And it works. It works really well. You have Clark, who's very much the fine, upstanding Boy Scout, and you have Kara, who's basically the hot mess, for lack of a better way to say it. And that's pretty much the entire crux of the story, is her working through her issues and ultimately still coming to the same conclusion that she's still going to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. And that's a core part of her character that she can't run away from. And so that was probably the biggest strength of this film. That said, towards the end of the film, it does stumble a little bit. It's not to the point of it just ruining the whole movie. It just feels like some parts of the third act needed to be tightened up a little in terms of the overall action and the overall stakes, because you had one really functional climax that kind of built up that tension of the usual tension of, oh, are they going to survive? Are they going to actually make it? But then the film kind of repeats itself, where it tries to essentially do the same type of climax just later in the film, and not even like much later. It was like a good 5 or so minutes after we already had the big major climax that led to kind of the start of the big epic final battle. But out of everything that I've seen, that's probably the only major failing I can give this film, is that the third act is where things kind of stumble a little bit. It felt like they weren't quite sure how to get from point A to point B in terms of how they wanted the film to end, and specifically how they wanted to differentiate Kara as a hero who is separate from Clark in terms of how she thinks, how she conducts herself, how she operates. And so you can tell they had bits they wanted to get to. It's just the connective tissue in between that needed a little bit of work. But beyond that, it's a well put together film with a great deal of nuance that does a good job of filling in yet another corner of this new DC cinematic universe under the direction of James Gunn. And I also like that these films aren't out to be glorified trailers for the next glorified trailer like a certain other major cinematic universe. Instead, it very much is following the same approach as the comics, where it's basically, okay, let's take these established characters and tell a story with them. And with Supergirl specifically, a character who hasn't really had much luck when it comes to cinematic outings, they basically decided, okay, how can we tell this story that establishes how she is different from her more famous relative? And I would say it did a pretty good job of it. It's not perfect. There are definitely some elements that could have been a little bit neatened up. But if you go into this with the context of this being a continuation of the previous film in mind, not necessarily in the sense that it's a direct sequel that is moving the story forward, but more a direct response to the previous film, it's perfectly enjoyable and perfectly serviceable. I enjoyed it for what it was. I didn't go into this expecting this to evoke the same emotions in the same way that Superman did. And I think that's largely the point that we're going for, is that unlike Clark, who's the put together Boy Scout who, despite being put together, still is capable of making mistakes, you have someone who's a little less secure in her identity, but still can't resist the urge to do the right thing. Whether it's because of Clark's example or because of other in-story reasons that are given during the film, or even just because that's her nature just as a character, you could probably make a number of different arguments there, but that was probably the biggest strength, is that it's a nice, detailed look at a character that finds a way to do its own thing while still feeling part of that same cohesive universe. As for the acting, it was fine. It's not like any of the performances were bad. You could tell that Jason Momoa was having fun as Lobo, and Millie Alcock manages to balance that sense of vulnerability that the role called for. Someone who's insecure, someone who clearly is just trying to struggle and find their place in this wider universe, especially being one of the last Kryptonians. And it also legitimately surprised me because I thought it was going to go in one specific direction in terms of how they established Kara's origin in this universe. And let's face it, Kara Zor-El is a character whose origins have been very, very wonky, depending on who's writing it in what given era. I mean, insert joke about Crisis on Infinite Earths here. And so, yeah, in terms of my thoughts on Supergirl, I enjoyed it. It's not perfect, but it's not nearly as bad as people are making it out to be, especially if you go into this film willing to look at it as a complement to Superman rather than expecting the same film again. It's not really a sequel in the sense that it's a direct continuation. It's just more of a thematic complement that shows a different corner of the same universe, almost like you're seeing a bit of history through another perspective. And that's honestly the film's biggest strength. So, yeah, those are my thoughts on Supergirl. I enjoyed it. I definitely would say that you shouldn't go into this expecting MCU levels of cohesiveness. It's just out to do its own thing and actually has the confidence to follow through. So, yeah, those are my thoughts on Supergirl. I enjoyed it. Now, if you excuse me, I better get home and try to sleep and hope that someone doesn't try to set the state on fire again.